Willkommen to the Filmlings Podcast World Tour.
A special summer series where we explore filmmaking from around the world.
Ich bin Jonathan.
Und ich bin Alex.
Und das ist Woche 29, Dunkel, Deutschland.
Yep, Dark Germany. And why are we talking about Dark Germany today, Jonathan? What film movement are we talking about today?
We are talking about the movement that started the movements. We are going farther back on this podcast than we have ever gone before, back to the 1920s and German Expressionism, which is, I know we've talked about how explosive the French New Wave was and Italian neorealism, but truly German Expressionism is kind of the mother of film movements, with lots of darkness and creepiness, because we're coming in between the two world wars and lots of frightening things are going on.
Right, and it's the one that so many others draw from explicitly. They explicitly state that they draw from German Expressionism, and it brings out some of our darkest films, whether they be part of a movement like Italian neorealism, or if we're just talking about some of the films we talked about last week, like Pan's Labyrinth. That was very expressionistic, as we kind of pointed out last week. And after today, we hope we'll explain this well enough that you'll see how expressionistic it was.
Yeah, there's a lot to cover, but I mean, we are still seeing influences of German Expressionism, and not in like watered down ways, but like you said, very explicit ways. A lot of early Tim Burton, and we'll go into more of those modern examples, but this is one of those shockwaves that is still rippling and will probably, it shaped how films are made, just period. So fundamentally, this movement will probably continue until films are no longer being made. Right.
So where did German Expressionism come from? Well, back in 1917, back when Germany was still an empire, the Kaiser and the government consolidated all of the film studios, or almost all of the film studios, into one big film studio called UFA, spelled all caps UFA, and it probably stands for something in German, but I'm not going to remember it in German, so everyone just calls it UFA, and that's pretty good. But since it was state-sponsored, it was used to pump out a bunch of propaganda during World War I, and because of all of that money coming into it, it was the strongest studio, the strongest film market in Europe after World War I, and the only one that could even kind of compete with Hollywood at the time. And it was so strong, and even attracted some of the most famous filmmakers, ones who originated there, but also ones from other countries like Alfred Hitchcock, who came over as a 25-year-old to work on intertitles on German films at the time before he went back to London, like so many other filmmakers who kind of bolted when fascism came a knocking in the mid.
Smartly.
Yeah, right. It was a good idea. No one wanted to be there, and that was a good call. But what films are we going to be talking about today, Jonathan?
Yeah, and just real quick, we will include a link to a crash course video if you want to get a little bit more detail about the history of German film. But today we'll be talking about, firstly, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the epitome of German Expressionism. This film comes from Dekla, which is a little small studio that is not state sanctioned. So we're getting back into this kind of idea of reactionary filmmaking, like we've seen with most of our other movements, and is directed by Robert Vine. And its influence is everywhere, and we'll get into that all in a second.
Yeah, and our second film for today is Nosferatu. It, too, was from an indie studio called Prana Film, but it was based on Bram Stoker's Dracula, and it was directed by F.W. Murnau, who didn't have the right to Bram Stoker's Dracula, but he did it anyway, and we'll get into how he did that when we get to the movie in particular. But it is an interesting story.
Right. And finally, we'll be talking about Metropolis, the kind of origin of science fiction filmmaking. And this is from UFA, so it is state sanctioned and was heavily censored because of all the regulations. We'll talk about all that. And it is based on a book by Thea von Harbo, and directed by Fritz Lang, one of the great directors in the German Expressionism and past it. And we will, again, talk about all of that when we get into the meat. So let's do that. Let's get into it. And Alex, set us up for The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
That's right, Jonathan. We're taking it all the way back to 1920, officially the oldest film we're going to talk about on the Filmings podcast so far.
Probably will be for a while.
For a very long while.
Unless we do the Great Train Robbery or Trip to the Moon.
Yeah, geez. Although, I don't know. They're good. I don't know how much meat there is for a full podcast, but it's good. They're worth checking out. Anyway, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is crazy, and I don't want to go too much past the halfway point of the film because it's so easy to spoil towards the end, but we will get into that because it is so influential, and how we still get Shyamalan to these days at the end of films. With twist endings and such. But at the start of the film, it's the story of a man, his best friend, and the woman who they're both in love with, as they are terrorized by a traveling showman / quote-unquote doctor who arrives at their town in Germany with a somnambulist. I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. In tow.
A person who sleeps all the time.
Yeah, he's essentially a sleepwalking zombie, and he does whatever the doctor tells him to do. And the doctor is there for the carnival, but a string of murders starts happening in the town, and it's suspected that it's the somnambulist. And guess what? It is. That's not really a spoiler. That was pretty obvious, but it is him, and he starts terrorizing this man, his best friend, and the woman they're in love with in particular. And it's a dive not only into this kind of basically horror story of this sleepwalking zombie and this man behind him who's out to get our main character, but also the psyche of the main character, and how reeling and disorienting the world around him is.
Right. And like the biggest way that this is portrayed in the film, which is one of the biggest points for, film analysts and, people who see the film, the biggest thing they notice is the mise en scène, which I don't think we've actually defined on the podcast before, surprisingly.
Right. We might have mentioned it, but it's one of those terms that really comes up only in the study of filmmaking rather than the making of filmmaking. Not many people are like, have you considered the mise en scène of this scene while we're on set? No, they talk about the individual's parts of it, but it is a good way to refer to what goes into a frame and how those things are arranged as a collective, and certainly as an academic reference point.
Right. So it literally means what's in the scene, and it refers to anything that is inside of your frame for a shot or for a scene. So that includes the colors, that includes the props, that includes the sets, that includes, where the actors are and stuff like that. So it's everything that goes together to make up a shot. And it's usually brought out more specifically in things like this, which we'll see, where all of those elements are put in there very intentionally and manually, as opposed to going on location and just kind of using what's already existing. So in this film, it feels very theatrical because the way that it's done is it's all in a studio and the sets are built, and literally because of the technology and the amount of money that they had, instead of, being able to be very particular with how the lighting was, they would paint shadows onto the set, and they would create their whole scene, which works for them logistically and also because of the story, because we are in this very twisted and warped world, and that comes out literally in the way that the sets and the whole scenes are designed.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that is where the expression in German Expressionism comes from, is that this mise en scène wasn't used realistically. It wasn't an attempt to depict the world as it was, like Italian neorealism. it was an attempt to express certain emotions, certain themes, certain feelings through the mise en scène. So it is hyper exaggerated in parts, and by parts I mean the entire thing. But it's used in that expressive way, and that's where expressionism comes from.
Yeah, and that carries over into even the makeup. So all of the characters, either if there are protagonists, they have very, well done makeup, and it's very smooth and bright. And then if it's the somnambulist or the doctor, they're very heavy eyeshadow and not like hiding it either. And that's another thing. I don't know how much detail was like that you could see when these were projected originally, depending on the technology. But nowadays we have very high quality prints of these films. And all of these can be found online. I'll include links to them in the blog post. But like you can see all the makeup, you can see all the different like places where the sets are painted and where the walls are and stuff like that.
Yeah, that was a question I had as I was watching it, was how much of this makeup is part of the expressionist movement, the expressionist quality of the film, and how much is just practical, like we need to be able to see the expressions that are being made on these people's faces, and let's get some really strong makeup on there so it can cut through the grain or the quality of the film stock. And I'm sure that wasn't too big of a deal, because back in 1920, I'm sure this film looked great on screen. But like you said, we're watching these high definition scans from modern days, and the prints that were found were pretty degraded. They weren't great, and we'll talk a bit about why that is and overall later on. But that's been a consistent problem with old films, and that's why they sometimes look so cruddy or low quality, is that the film stock itself, the physical film that it was recorded on and then exhibited on, is just degraded. It's rotting.
Yeah, it's very, very old, and celluloid is one of the most durable mediums, and filmmakers are still putting their film on celluloid to preserve it, but it has to be kept in a certain way and very like particular. And whenever film was just starting, like you have to remember, this is within probably 2 decades of motion pictures even being invented, and no one was really thinking about that. They were just kind of making stuff and probably assuming that it would probably live for a little bit and then it didn't really matter. But nowadays we have this high interest in where films come from and what films influenced ours and stuff like that. So there's a lot more emphasis on preserving that. Yeah.
And it wasn't, film wasn't considered art when it was first around. In fact, it wasn't considered art for a very long time, until you hit the 50s and the 60s and the generation that brought up the film brats who started actually studying it in actual film schools. Even people like Alfred Hitchcock weren't really considered artists in their day. And we talked about that back in the French New Wave episode, how Alfred Hitchcock wasn't really considered an artist until the French New Wave kids came along in the 60s and were like, hey, this guy is not just a really good technician at his craft of making really entertaining films, he's an artist. He has his own signature. And that applied not only to the people making the films, but the films themselves. And there was no high regard for keeping them around or preserving them. And studios, when back, especially in the silent film days, where they would make hundreds or thousands of films a year, would just be clearing them out to make space after you exhibit them. There was no need to keep them around. But as time progressed, there was more and more of an interest in preserving it to study, and just out of a respect of art, the same way you would want to keep the Mona Lisa around.
Right. And that's not to say that nobody put any value on these. Like, clearly they were still, considered a literary medium because you're telling stories and you're getting emotions across and stuff like that. But they weren't kind of put on the same par as painting or classic writing literature and stuff like that. I kind of get the sense, like, especially from researching the Surrealists, that it was kind of a hobby. So the Surrealists would do their art with their poems and their painting and stuff, and then they would see film and go, oh, hey, we can mess with that too.
Kind of like the YouTube of the early 20th century.
Right. So that's a pretty good comparison, as we're seeing more, the range of ways that, YouTube and modern online distribution can be used in kind of a flippant way, or it can actually be used in a more, legitimate way that other areas of the entertainment industry really need to pay attention to it.
Right. And you see a similar shift in TV if you look at it from its origins in the early 1950s and 60s to nowadays, when we're living in a new golden age of TV, where TV is considered basically high art, and with stuff like Game of Thrones or Breaking Bad, where it wasn't considered that back in the 50s and 60s. It was considered a passing fad. And that's just the general arc that a lot of art mediums take before they're taken seriously. And it is kind of a bummer that these early films that are so good and warrant their own episode in our book, and we love talking about them, were treated so badly, and now we're kind of left with, I don't want to say a shadow of what they used to be, but definitely not the full quality of what they used to be.
Yeah. But that's, again, not to say that they weren't taken completely seriously, because they were still trying to say things. Like, to bring it back to the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the filmmakers were expressing through this story of Dr. Caligari, who turns out to be, the doctor of this mental asylum, and then that's when all the twists and turns start happening in the story. But it's really an expression of these filmmakers who had lived through World War I and had this kind of deep-seated distrust of authoritarian figures and all this kind of things. And this is why you see them all leaving before World War II starts. But they're expressing these things that they experienced during World War I, and they have to release in some way. And the art of film was their way to do that.
Yeah. German Expressionism was one of the earliest movements that was about making film with a message.
Sometimes heavy-handedly, as we'll see in a little
bit. Metropolis. What? Anyway. But yeah, it was definitely serious filmmaking by filmmakers who took their art, or their craft, at least at the time, seriously, and what they were trying to do and what they were trying to convey. And there's a reason that The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a little film from an indie studio in 1920, is still around and still discussed today, seriously, almost 100 years. Like, in 3 years, this film will be 100 years old, and that's insane. But there's a reason it's still around. It's the film that kicked off the German Expressionist movement and helped push the idea of bringing meaning into film, and not necessarily focusing on realism in a film farther than it had been before.
Right. And one other technique things that we should talk about with the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, like we said, it's very theatrical, because, originally film was literally just translating theatrical performances onto a stage with a camera in the audience instead of people in the audience. So you get, this idea of a proscenium developed story where you have, one wall that is your audience, and the rest, you build the rest around that. And so that's what we see a lot in this movie. But one way we still get into the action, and one of those ways is what's called selective framing, where basically we take one character, put them against one wall that's one color, and we shoot their clothes very face up. So all we're seeing is one thing, which is the character's face. And it really helps to highlight either the emotion that they're experiencing at that point or whatever. But it's an easy way to just kind of punch into a story, get an emotion, and punch back out and see the fuller version. And some of the nuanced ways of using those close-ups and stuff like that, we're still just beginning in some of these films. And I think we talked about in the biopics discussion was The Passion of Joan of Arc. And that film is famous for its selective framing, because it is so many close-ups of the priests and of Joan of Arc, basically the whole film. So all of those techniques of using this for effect was just developing, and we're seeing that start here.
Yeah, and it's a great way to get into the subjective filmmaking that's being used here, because this is like when you said this is definitely a crazy movie in the literal sense. It is, and it's exploring this main character's psyche and the psyche of the ones around him, whether they're real or not. So again, like, you get all that emotion and all of that subjective nature by feeling close to a character and being able to see their emotions. So those getting up close to their face is important.
And it's interesting to see like how far we've come as far as using these close-ups and techniques to isolate a character's face and emotion and stuff. And oftentimes it's used, with shallow depth of field. So you're throwing the background of the shot out of focus, and that kind of makes the same effect as if you were putting them against a solid color wall, while still keeping our understanding of the geography of the scene the same. But there's one example that I just wanted to bring up that I was thinking about while thinking about selective framing, which is a shot in Vertigo where Jimmy Stewart's character sees the love interest character for the first time, and she walks, like, she's not interacting with him, but she walks past him and stops in a perfect profile with a very red wallpapered wall behind her, and her hair is notably white, and she stands out so much, and everything is blurred and kind of, hazy in a very cinematic way. But it's kind of that same effect that Hitchcock is using, where he's putting this practically solid color wall behind her to highlight her, putting her center framed. And it's really a striking shot that you remember. And it's a pretty pivotal shot too, because that's kind of the inciting incident for all the rest of the stuff that happens in that movie. And the twists and turns in that movie could probably be traced back to Caligari anyway.
Oh, a lot of Hitchcock can be traced back to German Expressionism. And not to mention the fact that, as we already mentioned, Hitchcock freaking worked in Germany during the German Expressionist period.
And just to be specific, like, he was taking, because we'll talk about this a little bit too in overall, but with silent films, you have, obviously, people kind of move their mouths, and then you have a title card that says what they said. And so with silent film, it was really easy to export those overseas into other languages, because all you have to do is take the title card out, translate it, and slip a new one in. And that's how Hitchcock got his start, was translating title cards into English and bringing those German films to British audiences.
Right, exactly. So just goes to show, kids, you might be translating one day, and you might be the best director ever, arguably the next.
We have some interesting career changes in this week.
Yeah, certainly. We certainly do. But I just want to mention one other thing about acting in the expressionist sense. And I don't think I think acting is something we should talk about more on the podcast. And we will hopefully, fingers crossed, get to that when we, and by we, I mean I, do some more research on it. Because Jonathan knows his stuff. I'm a bit behind. So that's my burden. But with the German Expressionist movement, it even permeated beyond the costume and beyond the makeup to how the actors moved in particular. And in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, notably, is how the somnambulist, the sleepwalker moves. And his name, which if you read it in English, just looks like Caesar, but people swear to me it's Cesare.
My dyslexic brain kept saying Caesar too.
Yeah, I swear it's Caesar. But anyway, he moves in a very particular way that's pseudo-zombie-like, very kind of dreamlike and very creepy and very lurky, and the way he holds his body, which is not a very realistic way of acting at all, but it is expressly effective in this expressionist setting. And it's something that we're going to see not only in this film today, but in all of the films today, is the way the characters move is keyed towards the expressionist theme of the set around them.
Yeah, and we see that especially with the antagonists in all three of these films, but even the protagonists have this extremely over the top way of acting, which looks very odd from our perspective. But once you watch a couple, you get more used to it. And if you've watched any amount of theater, you kind of have this sense because, again, these actors are all coming from stage. They're coming from playing big for an audience who's physically far away. And it still helps in these scenes where the camera is far away and the resolution isn't that great. So, having those big expressions and those big movements helps get the story across. And especially since it's a silent film, we're getting some of the dialogue through title cards, but not all of it. A lot of the motivations and stuff is coming through the actions. And I was actually thinking, when I was watching these movies this week, is you could probably show these movies to children and they'd be able to follow, even if they can't read the title cards, just because everything is so visual and so expressive again.
Yeah. The silent era of filmmaking is, besides the fact that it's something that probably doesn't get enough attention these days, it is maybe the most global era of filmmaking until we get to the point where we have active translators that we can just like plug into our brains and then we understand every language. But until then, until that Black Mirror episode that hasn't been made yet comes true, this silent era of film where it's not like language isn't the crux of the film is maybe the most global that film ever was. And we certainly see that in, German films being maybe the biggest film market of the time.
Right. And then it all gets ruined with World War II.
Yeah, as World Wars tend to do to things, they ruin it. But anyway, let's talk about our next film today, Nosferatu. And Jonathan, do you want to set us up for that one?
Yes, Bram Stoker's Nosferatu.
Just kidding. Don't sue us.
No, this film comes out in 1922, which is actually about 25 years after Dracula was actually written. So if that gives you a perspective of how these, when we're talking about this kind of copyright issue, that's how close that these things happen together. This is 10 years after Bram Stoker died. And it's very close to the story. We have our main character in this film called Hutter. He...
instead of Harker, wink, wink.
Instead of Harker, he works for basically a real estate agent, I think.
That's essentially what they do.
Right. And so they have a client who lives in some unnamed land of ghouls or shadows or whatever they called it. And he's like, you can make, his boss tells him, you can make a lot of money, but you got to go over there and bring him over here and he'll move into this great big house right across from yours. Doesn't that sound great? And so he does. He goes on this trip and brings back this really creepy guy who lives in a coffin. And so Nosferatu
might not suck blood.
Right. He gets this book that kind of explains the rules of Nosferatu, which is always useful. And then Nosferatu escapes and Hutter kind of has to race him back to town because Nosferatu has seen a picture of his wife and has this weird obsession with her and this telepathic connection thing going on. So they get back and Nosferatu starts preying on people. And then Hutter's wife realizes that there's this way to stop Nosferatu. And I guess I won't go to the end, but that gives you the overview.
You're getting really close to the end. It ends kind of abruptly, but...
Yeah, it does.
But, like, that's not the meat of the film is the ending. Like, the meat of the film is how...
It's not as twisty as Caligari.
Yeah, no. It's how just gosh darn creepy it is. Like, yeah. Wow, it's so creepy. Count Orlok instead of Count Dracula is
right.
Is just creepy. I mean, he's the signature vision of Dracula outside of like the kind of like poppy US style with the red lined cape and giant fangs. But this is like the creepy old shriveled old man.
Yeah, he's still like the canon vampire.
Yeah, I mean, this guy, they freaking put Nosferatu in an episode of SpongeBob SquarePants. So, but one of the reasons he's so creepy, besides the expressionist makeup and expressionist costumes, is the movement. And not only the movement that the actor uses to portray him, but like the special effects movement around him, which, let me just say, is essentially just stop motion. It's just stop motion. But like once you're into the film, like you don't notice the stop motion too much. Like
yeah, there were actually some
like
points that I wasn't sure how they did some of the stuff. Like he at some point stands up and he just kind of like he just raises up, and I was like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, like pivots on his feet and then without bending any of his body, like remains straight as a board and just rises. And I have no idea, like, did they use strings? What? But it's essentially just stop motion. They used stills and then played them for a few frames each. But, you know, it's noticeably stop motion, but it's also noticeably creepy.
Right. And it's still creepy. Like even to this day, in the YouTube comments of the one that I'll post in the blog post, there's actually one of the comments says, I didn't think that this movie was going to be scary, but Count Orlok is creepy as all get out. That's a little censored version. But it's like, still, people are still being affected by this movie because it's like the expressionism, like we've been talking about, the way that it's done with the makeup. And I mean, just the character design of Nosferatu is horrifying. And then you put that together with the set design, the very gothic and angular sets. And it's not
like quintessentially gothic.
Right. And it's not as like theatrical as I was saying that the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was. These aren't painted sets anymore. We're actually in places with this architecture, at least built out a little bit for the film. So all of that just pulls together and actually makes this really good film that still holds up pretty well.
Yeah, it definitely does. And it is classic Dracula, like you said. This is maybe the launching point for the whole Dracula franchise as it exists in film. Right.
And another thing, technically, that kind of flows from Dr. Caligari, but is really specific to Nosferatu, is this idea of tinting in the films. So when a lot of these old films were played back through a projector, I mean, projector is literally just light being shown onto a wall. And one of the effects that they would do, since all of these films are shot in black and white, but they would take a little piece of colored gel and hold it in front of the projector for certain scenes. So either be an orange gel or a blue gel, which would in turn give a cast to the whole film. So anytime you've seen a sepia film, that's because the orange tinting to it. And that tells you if it's day or nighttime, which is really useful, especially in Nosferatu, because the whole film was shot during the day. And you cannot differentiate the daytime versus the nighttime shots in black and white unless you have that orange or blue tint on them.
Yeah, so you're just wondering why Nosferatu, Dracula, is like casually walking across the street in the middle of the day with a coffin. Like,
yeah,
you're like, oh, right, this is supposed to be night. This is really nighttime. Creepy. Yeah. Like, oh, yeah.
And we'll talk about, why we have different versions and what the different, like, what we do with them now that we have all of these different kinds, because you can find it in black and white or you can find it with the tints on it. But basically, this is just a preface to say that if you're going to look for a version of these films, especially Nosferatu, probably try and find one with the tints on it, because you'll have a little bit more of a comprehensive viewing.
Yeah, I certainly recommend that. I even recommend it for Caligari, because I've seen both films multiple times, and times with the tint, times without the tint. And the times with the tint are just a little bit better. Another thing I'll say about Nosferatu is that the intertitles on Amazon just totally forget that F.W. Murnau was trying to dodge a lawsuit and just replace all the characters' names with what they were in the book. So there's that too. A lot of standardization issues with silent film, as we'll get into, but that was definitely one of them.
Yeah, and as far as, talking about the original Dracula story, and what he means by that is that, like, the character names in the English translated intertitles will sometimes have the names from Dracula as opposed to the character names from Nosferatu. But it was interesting because both of us are pretty familiar with Dracula. We've read it multiple times. It's one of our favorite stories. And knowing that story so well kind of makes Nosferatu feel abbreviated. I mean, it is abbreviated, but it feels shorter. And you mentioned that it kind of ends abruptly, and it does. But I'm not sure if that's because of how the pacing of the film feels, because it isn't until like at least halfway through the film that they even get back to the house where Hutter and his wife live and stuff like that. So a lot of it takes place in what is relatively the beginning of Dracula, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, like the first 15 chapters or
right. But I mean, that might just be because we know all of the other elements that go into the book. And it's also, has to do again with the fact that pieces are changed here and there. Like it is recognizably Dracula, but the ending is changed and stuff like that. But
some characters are just totally cut out.
Right. And that makes sense as far as abbreviating. But still, it was too close for Bram Stoker's family and the Stoker Foundation or whatever there was of it. Like I said, this is fairly soon after he died. But when the film was released, those people in charge of Bram Stoker's intellectual property actually ordered the film to be burned and destroyed. And all the copies, I believe, except for one of them were. So all of the copies that we have and that you'll find are actually derived from this one negative that survived this witch hunt, if you will, for the Nosferatu film. And that is actually something that will carry over in this idea of censorship and trying to get back our original copy of the film in Metropolis. So Alex, tell us what that movie is about.
So Metropolis from 1927 is the granddad of all dystopian stories. I'm sure there were some before it, but this is maybe the quintessential one. It wasn't super popular when it came out, but a few years later, it was highly regarded, and we can see its influences ranging all the way to modern-day dystopians, Hunger Games.
And modern-day science fiction, like Blade Runner.
Right, which is also kind of dystopian. So Metropolis itself is the story of a metropolis, shocker, story of a giant city, or really two cities, because there's a ruling class on top, an elite that lives in the shiny, technically advanced city with everything they could ever want. But it's powered by the working class who lives in the undercity and who, the quote, worker city, and works all of the machines and essentially provides all of the power and all of the services for the upper class that lives in the upper city. And these machines are not like nice machines either. They destroy...
Steampunk.
Yeah, it's like steampunk, but they destroy the people who work on them. It's not easy work or nice work at all. And between these two classes, in the upper class, you have the son of the leader who falls in love, basically in the second scene, with one of the leaders of the working class. I believe she's either a teacher, either that, or she's just a professional revolutionary, stirring people up. I'm surprised she doesn't have a guillotine in her back pocket.
Yeah, it seems like she's a teacher because the first thing that we see of her is she walks into one of the gardens in the rich upper class with a group of children and says, "This is where the rich people play. These are your brothers." And kind of to the rich people, "These are your brothers." We are morally on the same level with you. You just have put yourselves in a different social strata.
Yeah, everything she does seems to be an attempt to storm the Bastille. But
yeah, basically, this movie reminded me of Les Mis a lot.
I'm just referencing the Revolutions podcast with Mike Duncan. But anyway, back to Metropolis. There is yet another storyline because we haven't mentioned how this is so sci-fi yet other than the steampunk machines. And that's this mad doctor of sorts who I'm not entirely clear on his connection. Actually,
yeah, me too. We'll talk about that.
Yeah, I'm not entirely clear on his connection to the leader of the city, who is our main character's dad, as I've mentioned before. But essentially, he's building like a robot cyborg person to essentially his motive is to help bring down the leader of the city. Whereas the motive,
which is interesting because he's doing it for the leader of the city.
Yeah, he's like trying to double cross him essentially. Whereas the working class woman is trying to get the quote head and the hands to work together, and she needs a mediator. And the young man, the son of the leader who falls in love with her, sets out to be that mediator to bring the heads and the hands together and be the quote heart of the story. And
we're not spoiling anything. This movie isn't subtle.
No, it's way over the top. And if we haven't mentioned the fact that this was censored by the government, I feel like this is a good point to bring it up, because it definitely feels like it's arguing for a certain kind of social structure or arguing against certain social structures.
Yeah, it's been said that this film like falls in kind of the communist camp.
It's like almost
it's not like explicit, but I can see where, if you're afraid of it being communist, you could pull that out of it.
Yeah, and you know what? I thought that for most of the film, and it might have been censorship towards the end. I'm not super clear on what exactly was censored, but towards the end, the way it ends doesn't make it feel like communism. It almost feels like raging against the terror of the masses. Yeah,
but as long as we're mentioning the censorship, basically, if you watch this film on Netflix, it'll tell you at the beginning, parts of this film were lost and thought that they were just totally gone, until we found a display print of the film in Argentina, of all places. And so parts of this is a display print, so it's not as high fidelity as the original negative, which we have of a large portion of the film and which we can restore to very high qualities. And those parts look great. But there is a noticeable difference in quality when you get to those pieces that have been put back in, and there are still pieces that were missing. And we've kind of been able to figure out, and there are titles that have been taken out and stuff like that. But thankfully, at least for the titles, we were able to find records from the German government of, what words were taken out and censored. And so we can say, oh, okay, and put them back in. So a lot of work has been done to get this film as close as possible back to the original. But watching the film and watching the pieces that are low quality and messed up just kind of shows it's kind of like a physical scarring that you can see as a personification of what censorship does.
Yeah, and it very much was a treasure hunt to try to put this film back together. And I think we've talked about film restoration a little bit before in the podcast, and we certainly are going to talk about it a bit more in overall. But especially with these old films, it's something that you almost just have to get used to, because so many of them are falling apart. Like we said, they're almost 100 years old, which, on the grand scale of human history doesn't sound that long, but it is a really long time. Yeah.
And, there's a really interesting discussion of censorship in this video that I'll include in the blog post, which is a conversation between Jean-Luc Godard and Fritz Lang, like very long after all this stuff, towards the end of Fritz Lang's career. And I believe that that's kind of one of the reasons for the conversation, was to kind of get his thoughts and preserve a lot of his feelings about film and filmmaking and stuff like that. And he really respected Jean-Luc Godard. But at some point, they talk about the different kinds of films and subject matter that different countries that they've worked in are okay with. And they say, there are films that I've made in France that I couldn't make in the US, and vice versa. And Fritz Lang makes the comment that there are films he's made where the scene that he specifically made the film for, like the most important scene to him, are the scenes that got cut out of the film. And he doesn't know, like, is this really the film that I wanted to make after all of these changes from whatever, authority he's working under at the time have come about?
Right. And censorship has certainly faded over the years in some ways it hasn't. That's an interesting. Yeah. It's changed, and that's essentially that's a very interesting question. Maybe for another day to go in depth with on modern censorship, but for today, it's just important to remember that these films have been through a ringer and through a journey of their own, outside of just the ones they depict in terms of storytelling. Yeah,
and it just kind of shows what a different world that these films were made in, and they kind of are a historical document outside of their fictional and literature merits.
And another thing that we've been talking about a lot today, the mise en scène of each of these films, it's fairly unique in Metropolis, both because it was the only UFA-backed film, so they had just a ton of cash. So you can see how big the sets are, how intricate the sets are, and how many
actual special
extras they shove into each scene. And like you said, with the special effects, but also the fact that Fritz Lang's background is as an architect. He used to design buildings for a living, and you can really see it in Metropolis. The big machine sets are, in a certain respect, grotesque because of what they represent, but in another respect, just beautiful because of the design.
The design of the city reminded me a lot of Asimov's description of Trantor from Foundation. Because it's just this description of this city that, people only live at the very top of it, but it goes all the way down. And basically the whole planet is just metal because it's all been taken over by a city. And I'm sure that this film is kind of a lot of the origins for that into Asimov and a lot of the classical sci-fi authors.
Right. This was certainly an influence on just so much of the sci-fi genre, not only within film, but like you said, within the realm of novels and stuff of that sort. And also, you mentioned it a second ago, but the special effects in this film are really well done. I was genuinely impressed by what they pulled off in terms of showing these rings of electricity around the weird cyborg android robot character. I'm not clear on my definitions of each, but they're really, really well done and super convincing. They're essentially the bolts of lightning that you'd expect in a Frankenstein comes to life scene, but it almost kind of is that kind of scene.
It's probably the origin of that kind of scene.
Right. And just on top of that, the meshing of miniature sets that are
matte
being
paintings
destroyed and matte paintings, they all come together fairly seamlessly. And we've talked about how rough the final copy of this film is these days because it's been
certain parts
lost and censored and recut together. But even with all of that, the special effects just really hold up, which is impressive because they're almost 100 years old.
Yeah, it's and as far as influences that come out of this, you have the Metal Woman bears striking resemblance to original sketches of C-3PO and even the final version of C-3PO, and also the fact that the scientist who creates the Metal Woman is missing a hand, and says I'm missing a hand is nothing compared to creating life or whatever, something like that. But these elements that are pulled through as classic sci-fi elements that build our current perception of good sci-fi, it still holds up.
All right, let's slide on over into overall notes, and boy, do we have a lot to talk about today. For a movement that was so impactful in so many ways, and brought a lot of first and a lot of new outlooks to the way we tell stories through film. And the first one I just want to recap and kind of get out of the way because we've talked about it so many times over the course of this podcast. But subjective storytelling and the way we get inside of our characters' minds and explore their emotion and explore their mental state. And specifically, because now we're in the spoiler section, quick warning, I want to bring up the twist ending of Dr. Caligari. Because it turns out at the end that we have a crazy narrator. He's literally in a mental institute, and the actor who we saw as Dr. Caligari, the man with the hypnotized somnambulist, is actually in charge of the mental institute. He's the lead doctor, and the woman who he thought was his fiance is another crazy person in the mental hospital.
And the somnambulist too.
And the somnambulist too. I almost got it right that time, I think.
Yeah, that's pretty close.
I'm proud of myself. Anyway, they are all in this mental institute, and the entire thing might have been made up the entire time. So we don't know if it actually happened, but that doesn't mean it wasn't an interesting story. It just means it was a really interesting end to a really interesting story, and kind of harps on the emotional and mental disorientation that we feel throughout watching the film, and the odd mental state of the character that we get to experience through that subjective storytelling.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the ending almost leaves a little bit of room for ambiguity because they end up locking up our protagonist, who we've been following the whole time, who's been trying to catch Dr. Caligari in the act of murdering or using this somnambulist to murder people. But at the end, they put him in a straitjacket and put him in a isolation room, and then Dr. Caligari, the doctor, I don't know if his name is really Caligari or not, but he kind of turns and says, "I see. He thought that I was Dr. Caligari, this mythological figure. I think I have a way to help him now." Which, since you're reading that on a title card, either could be, "I think I know how to help him now. Like, he's on to me. I have to stop him." Or it could be, "Okay, now I can actually help him." So it leaves a little bit of room for ambiguity, and thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's always a more interesting note to go out on than too hard of a twist. Although, I think the point is that it works really well in this case. It works really well for the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and it helps seal its fate as such an epitomal film and such a wide-reaching film in terms of impact and effect.
Right. And so, with all that being said, we do want to kind of just talk about the experience of watching an old movie, because, a lot of people will say, "Man, that's so old, it's so cheesy and melodramatic and stuff like that." But, you have to take it in the context of the time. And there are certain things that, we can understand that will help us. The more we understand about it, the more we can notice them when we're watching things in this movie. So we've already talked about the theatricality and how, as film is getting on its feet and becoming its own art form, we're slowly transitioning from literally staged performances with a camera in front of them to this new kind of language of film. So in the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, we have sets, and we have it looks like, literally if a high school put on a show of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, it wouldn't look all that different, I imagine, than what the film does. And then in Nosferatu and Metropolis, we have some location scenes, and we have bigger sets and more built out, and they don't look painted and all this stuff. So we're getting more camera movement and all that kind of stuff as film develops. But there are other things that, you still are seeing that over-the-top acting in Nosferatu and Metropolis, because we're still having to convey thoughts and feelings silently. And the other thing that is kind of a little disconnect from going from modern film to silent film is the fact that it looks a little faster. And, that's kind of like a trope now of, the sped up walking and stuff like that. But there actually is a scientific reason that is. So basically, the way that a film camera captures motion is it lets light in through the lens, which hits a film strip, which is chemically treated to basically take in the undulating luminance of whatever light is in front of the camera lens. And then there are little cells on the film strip that, as in the old days, as a person would move this lever, it would rotate it and put a different amount and quality of light would be hitting each time a different frame was moving past the little the hole that the light was coming in through from the lens. And basically, eventually we came to a standard rate that this would happen. So basically the speed that you crank the knob at makes it go faster or slower. And originally the standard was about 16 frames per second. For detailed reasons, we'll leave a link to a video that explains all of this in very scientific mathematical detail. But basically it was 16 frames per second, which is about twice as fast-ish as our standard now, which is 24 frames per second. And that came about through the invention of sound and color and all of these factors that went into this very technical thing. Nowadays, it doesn't matter all that much with digital cameras and stuff like that. But just that fact that the other thing is that it's literally based on how fast the operator is cranking the camera. So it's not going to be exact every time. And, sometimes it would be used to different effect. If there's a horse race going on or something like that, someone is walking and needs to be running, just crank it a little faster and it'll make them look like they're moving faster, or crank it slower and they will be moving slower. And so that's kind of why you see that sped up motion in a lot of old films, and why everything you see nowadays is pretty standard unless you're watching like a Peter Jackson film.
Right. Something with like an overemphasis on slow-mo or something of the sort.
Or that's portrayed at 48 frames per second, like The Hobbits.
Yeah, and audiences haven't really warmed up to it yet. We'll see what happens in the future, but that'll be interesting. But it is certainly used very particularly in some of the films we talked about today. For instance, in Nosferatu, there's a point where Dracula is pretending to be his own coachman and picks up Harker or Hatter or Hodder or whatever you want to call him, Hutter, by the side of the road. And described in the book, like the wagon he drives, the carriage he drives, goes really freaking fast, and they use the over cranking to portray that, to make it look really, really fast. Or perhaps it's under cranking. I always get them backwards. But they have it's this really wide shot, and they have Harker walk into the frame, and then like pointedly he stands still, and then the cabinet comes down the side of this hill and is like just zipping along. But you can't tell that it's cranked differently because Harker's standing still.
Yeah, and another example is in Metropolis, when the robot woman, who's been given the face of the worker woman in order to deceive all of the followers that she's garnered, she does this seductive dance or whatever, but it's sped up really much. And that's a very like surrealist sequence just in general, with eyeballs and all kinds of stuff going on. That definitely was an influence on probably Salvador Dali and Louis Buñuel a couple years later. But that scene is sped up too, and it makes more of a jarring and kind of uncomfortable feeling as you're watching it. And just one other quick side note to throw in there, like even though the video seems sped up, again, these were shot silently, so all the music has been added in later after the fact. So even if the video is sped up, the audio won't be, depending on what audio track you get, and there are a lot of them out there. You want to talk about some of the things that we see that are different between different copies, just because of the non-standardization of these films that are so old and so, unstrictly preserved.
Right. So we're very used to today there being like one set version of a film. Maybe like a director will come out with like a director's cut at some point, but there's one standardized version. It is regulated by all of the different broadcasting and film organizations that we have to meet certain standards and fit in a certain box and go at a certain rate and be exactly this loud and so on and so forth. In 1920, they didn't have that. And it was kind of just fast and loose. And it was developing, but that wasn't really a thing. And distributors, especially exhibitioners, didn't really have anyone standing over their shoulder to make sure that this film was presented in this way. So whether or not that be, theater A plays this track, this set of music underneath the film, and theater B plays this other track or set of music underneath their film, because remember, we're before synchronous sound here. So
yeah,
there
or if they
isn't
have a
any
live
sound.
accompanist.
Yeah, they didn't. There is no sound on the film strip. If there was sound at all, it was made up by the exhibitioner, the movie theater at the time. Tents, like you were saying, it could be applied in the theater, or it could be a dyed film strip that was presented. But those weren't standardized either. They were done here and there. There was no guaranteed standard tinting of certain film strips like there would be these days, except everything's the same color, obviously. And obviously intertitles change between languages, and sometimes phrasing and meaning change, but sometimes people just rephrase things. Like I mentioned before, in the Amazon version of Nosferatu, they just toss out the made-up names that F.W. Murnau came up with and put in the original names from the book, which wouldn't have flown way back when, but, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and I don't know why we call it Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's just Dracula, but whatever.
As opposed to all the other people who,
as opposed to all the other Draculas, is well within the public domain these days. So Amazon could do that, or whoever created that version of the file for Amazon, and it's no problem. And like we mentioned before, film preservation wasn't really a thing until the mid 20th century. And it's become more and more of a thing, but the effect of not preserving any of those very early films, most of which, and I forget the stats off the top of my head, but most of the films from the earliest segment of film history just don't exist anymore. They're just gone. They rotted or they burned because early film was very flammable, or they were just thrown away by the studios, never to be found again. But there are people these days who are committed to preserving film and making sure art and these cultural artifacts stick around. And one of them is Martin Scorsese's Film Foundation, which I occasionally donate to. They have a very cool program where you can either donate a specific amount of money, or they show you a list of films they are currently preserving, and it's a $1 one frame. You pick a film you like, you pay X amount of dollars, and boom, you've preserved that many frames of the film. I don't know if that's exactly how it works, but that's one of the programs they run.
We'll include a link.
Yeah, to help make sure these pieces of our culture as a world, as a globe, stick around well into the future and can be enjoyed by future generations. And a podcast that will be started 100 or 200 years from now, and they want to do a German Expressionism week. Think of them, guys. Think of them.
Yes, we're creating a time capsule. But yeah, it's interesting because even these film preservation efforts that are being made, like at this point, any release that is done through these organizations is just going to be another version that's out there. There are already so many versions on Blu-ray and DVD of these films that were obtained, however they were. I'm not exactly sure what that process is like, but there just exist a lot of these are out there. I think Kino is a pretty famous one that tries to do good releases of these old films. But you kind of have to weed through it. And I'll include a link. I found just some blog page that's kind of this catalog of different versions of Nosferatu that have been released in different times. They've been covered by with music and the different, black and white versus color versions. And it's interesting also as far as the tinting, because a lot of times now our tinting is all done after the fact. So we have the digital version, which is pretty easy to just kind of, change the whites to yellow or to blue and stuff like that. So we can do it manually wherever we see fit. And one thing that I was noticing through the tinted versions that I was watching, that I'll include a link to, as I said, was sometimes when a character would enter a room with a candle or a candle would blow out, the tint would immediately switch from orange to blue or vice versa. And I was like, there's no way you could do that in a projection, because you'd have to like switch the gel like super quickly, like right on cue. So I'm wondering if that was just something that we're able to do now and we have the luxury of, and they would have to have held that gel, whatever gel it was already, up there till the scene changed. But there's just little things that we can kind of use to even spice up the tinting from the 1920 versions.
Yeah, that's right. And like we mentioned before, that film tinting can have a pretty large impact on the meaning of the film or the understanding of the film. It could be the difference between a vampire walking in the street in the middle of the day with a coffin or a really creepy vampire, Count Dracula, lurking at night with a coffin. What is he up to? There can be a big gap in difference of meaning there. And, all of these things can have a different meaning. And I think I've mentioned before, I mentioned last week, something about a version of Metropolis that was scored to Metallica. And I mentioned that because that exists.
Yeah. And that's like semi-official too.
Yeah. And it's, the different kind of music that you can put behind a film just impacts the meaning dramatically. And I think, it's something everyone recognizes, is that music is so deeply connected to emotion. But being able to switch the entire score of a film back and forth at a whim, or maybe not a whim, it's a lot of work, but being able to not have that standardized can not only destandardize the version of the film, but can also destandardize the emotion of the film. And that's an interesting thing that you have to look at when you look at these old films. Like, we don't know if the scores we watched this week or listened to this week were official in any way, shape, or form, because there probably wasn't an official score for any of these films.
Yeah, there's just kind of, better or worse. Some of the ones that you find on YouTube just kind of have this low droning synth that just kind of is an easy way to put a track on there, but some actually have orchestral pieces that are scored to match the timing of the film. So you kind of have to dig around and do some research and try and figure out which version you prefer if you're going to watch these films. And that kind of also goes into the idea that German Expressionism is a distinguishable movement, but it's distinct in film movements from like Surrealist and the French New Wave, in that there was no manifesto, there was no sort of written consensus across these creators as to what they're going for, or what kind of techniques and things that they were going to use. This is just kind of an organic development that was clearly influenced by each other, but there wasn't this communication of sync our watches and all create the same kind of thing. It just was this community of filmmakers in the same area undergoing the same stresses and political strifes, and using this method of German Expressionism to present their material.
Right. And it's one of, I feel like it's an important film movement to study if you're Absolutely. Into that kind of thing, like we are here on the Film Links or the Film Movement Links, because it didn't just impact the films it created or the films right after it, but it also impacted so many other film movements, like we mentioned before, like the French New Wave and Italian neorealism and the American New Wave were all heavily influenced by were all heavily influenced by German Expressionism. And even if you go on to look at like sets in some of early Spielberg blockbusters, like the Temple of Doom big set looks almost like one of the big sets in Metropolis. In its grandeur and its intricacy and its expressiveness, how dramatic it is and how focused it is on conveying the bigness of this emotion rather than trying to look like an authentic Temple of Doom type thing, which I don't even know what that would be, but here you go. It's a big expressive set.
Yeah, and you think of pretty much any film that Tim Burton made prior to like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and you're seeing these influences very heavily in his work. The castle from Edward Scissorhands could have literally been lifted straight out of Nosferatu. And also even with the 1989 Batman that we talked about forever ago on our podcast, has a lot of those elements of a very, we talked about how much his Gotham City looks like a set, but it's very done specifically so that the shadows and everything goes exactly where he wants it to. And that is all coming straight from these types of movies. Yeah.
And I will say the climactic scene of Metropolis is almost verbatim the climactic scene from Batman 1989. Like,
yeah, that's true.
It's shockingly close.
We had a lot of fighting on rooftops this week in all three of these films.
Well, yeah. Steep rooftops, man. Steep rooftops, high chairs, and creepily moving characters.
There you go. That's in a nutshell. You don't even have to listen to the whole episode.
Yeah, we really buried the lead on this one.
Yeah, but the other movement that comes heavily out of this movement is film noir, which, we called this episode Dark Germany, because that's what it is. It's using shadows and this dark, eerie feeling to great effect. And as you said, whenever all of these filmmakers emigrated out of Germany before World War II, they brought their influence to America and other parts of Europe kind of at this moment in the 30s and 40s when we're getting this interest in darker stories. We're starting to get influence from the Italian neorealists. We're starting to get the French New Wave. And so in America, we get a wave of crime thrillers that are very shadowy and contrasty and, morally ambivalent. And the style and aesthetic of the Gothic German Expressionism lends itself so well to those films. And we wouldn't have our film noir in the same way. And we wouldn't have our neo-noir without German Expressionism.
Right. Basically any film that you would think of as dark has some influences, if not a lot of influence, from German Expressionism. And I mean, basically, this is the start of horror on film. Like, Nosferatu and Caligari can both be considered horror classics, especially Nosferatu.
Right.
In terms of
I'm adding both of those to my Halloween watching list.
Oh yeah, certainly. And they have wide-reaching effect on both classic horror and modern horror. And you can find a through line through all of those films way back to German Expressionism. And like we said before, like any dystopian novel or any dystopian novel or dystopian movie based off of a dystopian novel, because they kind of all are, has roots in German Expressionism as well, especially Metropolis, which is like the quintessential dystopian sci-fi epic.
Yeah, and Metropolis even comes before, like Brave New World in 1984, which are kind of some of the classic on the literature side of dystopian novels. But this is even before those. So you have to imagine that those authors have probably seen this film and have ingested some of those themes. as heavy-handed as the thematic material in Metropolis was, it was
it's hard to miss.
Yeah, the definitely the technical and the epicness of the film comes off a lot better than its attempt at philosophizing.
Right. And part of that is the censorship struggles it went through, but
right.
It still stands the test of time. And of course, we can't not mention the twist endings, like the Shyamalan style twist endings. And not just the Shyamalan style twist endings, but the Shyamalan style everything. Like the darkness and the tension in all of these films can be pretty well found in all of Shyamalan's work, except maybe The Happening, but we won't talk about that.
All right, so this week we do have a little bit more of a further watching list if you want to get more into German Expressionism. And of course, you can also Google a lot of these movies. Just type in German Expressionism and Google puts a handy list for you right at the top of the search page. But a couple that you can find pretty easy access to would be like Destiny, which is another Fritz Lang film, which is available on Netflix. Also, The Golem is pretty standard as far as German Expressionism, and that's on YouTube. I'll include a link to that. And Vampire or Vampire, I don't know how you pronounce it with a Y.
That's probably just Vampire still.
Yeah, that's by Carl Dreyer, who is also the director of The Passion of Joan of Arc. He's a very influential director from the time period. You can find that on Filmstruck, which we've talked about several times over the podcast. And we have more from Filmstruck next week. What is that, Alex?
That's right. Next week, we're going back to the motherland. We're going to talk about Russia and more silent films, or at least 2 of them. So first, we're going to be talking about Battleship Potemkin from 1925 by Sergei Eisenstein, available on Filmstruck. Second, we're going to be talking about Po Zakonu by Lev Kuleshov from 1926, available on YouTube. And lastly, we'll be talking about Stalker from 1979 by Andrei Tarkovsky, available both on Filmstruck and YouTube.
Yeah, and Battleship Potemkin is actually also available on YouTube in varying qualities. So I'll find some link to that. But again, as we would talk about, you kind of have to take each one with a grain of salt. But yeah, we're getting one of the most legendary of Russian directors in Eisenstein. We're going to get into some more technique that comes out of Russia with Kuleshov, and a modern legend in Tarkovsky. It should be a lot of fun. I'm excited.
I mean, yeah, the Kuleshov effect is one of the most fundamental rules of filmmaking, and the topic we're really going to be talking about for at least 2/3 of the podcast is going to be Soviet montage, which montage is, don't just think about 80s montage, which is like song and pep and a lot of stuff happening at once. But think about one of the most fundamental things that can happen in a film, juxtaposing 2 images.
Absolutely. And we are getting way into all that next week, so stick around.
Should be fun, should be fundamental, which is always fun. But that's about all the time we have in Germany for now.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Geringer.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next week.
All right, I will see you in Russia. There is still more to Ling.
There's so much to Ling. The Linglings